Hello and welcome. You're watching the Global Reset on CNBC TV 18 Prime with me, Prashant Nair. This is the show where we try to connect the dots between geopolitical events, markets, economies, and bring expert analysis into our decoding. On the show today, we'll be joined shortly by Jim O'Neill, chairman of the Northern Gritstone and former commercial secretary at the UK Treasury. He, of course, also is the man who termed the acronym BRIC about 20 years ago. We'll discuss all things trade, tariffs, Trump, and of course, India-US relations as well. But before we get to Jim shortly, as always, let me just quickly get you up to speed with what's happened on the global front overnight. Well, a US judge temporarily blocked President Donald Trump from removing Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook. This is an early setback for the White House in an unprecedented legal battle that could upend the central bank's long-held independence. The ruling means that Lisa Cook will remain on the board of the central bank until her case is heard at length. CNBC's Steve Leisman had more on this.
Fed Governor Lisa Cook prevailing in every major legal point in a decision last night from a D.C. District Court judge, clearing the way for her to keep her job and participate at the upcoming Fed meeting, but the White House suggesting the case is not over yet. Judge Giacobbe issued a preliminary injunction against the president's firing of Cook, writing, quote, "The public interest in Federal Reserve independence weighs in favor of Cook's reinstatement. That independence is critical in helping the nation's banking system to promote stability." Cook had been, of course, accused of mortgage fraud for stating in documents that two homes were her primary residence. The president fired her in August. She immediately brought suit to stay the firing. The Justice Department opened an investigation, but Reuters reported recently that in the past 8 years, only one such case similar to Cook's has ever been prosecuted. Judge Cobb found that Cook is substantially likely to win on her claim that the president violated the Federal Reserve Act in firing her. On the three main elements, she found that firing for causes limited to actions taken in office, the court can review the president's decision in this regard, which the administration had argued it couldn't, and Cook was denied a right to respond to these charges. The judge several times relied on a recent Supreme Court comment that the Fed was different from other agencies. The White House spokesperson in a statement saying, "This ruling will not be the last say on the matter, and the Trump administration will continue to work to restore accountability and confidence in the Fed." Remains to be seen if the administration can be successful in getting an appeals court to overturn Cobb's ruling before this meeting next week, or if it even tries, the case could be headed to the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court affirms this decision, it would for the first time create precedent around the Fed's independence and the ability or lack thereof of the president to fire a Fed governor.
Well, it's all related, right? I mean, President Trump letting institutions like the Fed to function as they long have, or is there interference? Will that affect how foreign investors view, the U.S. assets, etc.? So it's a long tail in that sense. Now, let's just put the spotlight on the Fed Reserve a little bit more. Let's listen to what David Solomon, chairman and CEO at Goldman Sachs, had to say on this Fed independence issue.
First of all, I think that central bank independence, not just here but around the world, has served us well, and I think it's very, very important. I think Fed independence is very, very important around monetary policy. I think the people who are in the Fed and make these decisions, and by the way, it's not an individual, it's a committee of people that vote. I think they take it incredibly seriously. And I think as you look forward and you look at appointments, and by the way, we saw Stephen Murrin at his hearing talk about the fact that he thought Fed independence on monetary policy was very, very important. So presidents and administrations throughout history have had a point of view about policy rates, and they voice them. The people that go and act on monetary policy, I think, do it to a very high standard, and I'm confident that they're going to continue to do it. But I think it's important for all of us to appreciate how well central bank independence has served us. There's no question that when you look at the labor numbers, there's a little bit of softening, and I'm pretty confident that we'll have a 25 basis point cut. Whether or not we have a 50 basis point cut, I don't think that's probably in the cards. So I would expect a 25 basis point cut, and I think you could see one or two other cuts, depending on how economic conditions play out from here. But there's no question we're going to see a slight change, in the policy rate as we move into the fall. And I think it'll be really data dependent on how things evolve as we go through the rest of the fall as to how that plays out.
David Solomon, CEO of Goldman Sachs, also spoke about U.S. President's tariff policies and trade negotiations and, of course, how it's expected to impact growth in the U.S. Listen.
I think about where we are, there's still more work to do. And so, I think it's uncertain. I've said it a number of times, I think there's going to be a stickiness around how this all settles out. And I think we're continuing to see indications that that's something to watch very closely. So trade policy is still getting negotiated. It's still getting implemented. The administration has a clear point of view, but there's uncertainty around where this all lands. And there's no question in my mind that it's having an impact on growth. That impact on growth is hard to quantify specifically, and I think it's also very dependent on where a lot of this lands. There's obviously litigation now going on around some of the reciprocal tariffs. We have to watch that closely. There's still trade deals that have to be negotiated, particularly here in North America. So I'd say there's still uncertainty. There is an impact to growth.
Okay, we're going to slip into a quick commercial break here. Up next, we'll be joined by Jim O'Neill, chairman of the Northern Gritstone and former commercial secretary to the UK Treasury. And as I said, maybe best known as the man who termed the acronym BRIC. And of course, now it's BRICS with many more members. But everything about Trump, tariffs, India, US coming up in just a bit. Welcome back. As promised now, let me bring in Jim O'Neill into the conversation, back to this program. Jim, great to have you back. Our last conversation was exactly 2 months to this date. So much has happened since then, as I was sort of referring to earlier. It looked like back when we spoke that India would be the first in line to get a deal and, there'd be advantage India over other countries. It was exactly the opposite. Who would have thought? 50% tariffs, 25% plus 25 as a punishment for buying oil from Russia. Now, and that is, by the way, already old news, because the new news seems to be a little bit of thaw in relations. Both President Trump and Prime Minister Modi tweeting at each other, saying, well, we're natural partners, and a phone call perhaps in the next few weeks. How do you look at all of this, Jim? And do you think we are now, we've turned the corner from climbing the escalation ladder to a bit of a de-escalation here?
Good morning again, or good afternoon. It's a pleasure to try and fathom out, as always, what on earth is going on in Donald Trump's head. So my answer is who knows to some degree, but I did, in that interim period since we last spoke, Prashant, write a slightly tongue-in-cheek piece for Project Syndicate called Is Donald Trump a secret agent for the BRICS? Because I would imagine in many, many global diplomatic circles, and I've seen quite a lot said about this, that people must be shocked by the way in which Trump has provoked important leaders around the world, including Modi, and also, of course, the ongoing things in Brazil, which is almost like an invitation for the BRICS leaders to treat each other more seriously, as evidenced by the meeting in Beijing last week. And maybe Trump has realised that he's made a bit of an error and he's trying to back down. But I quickly add, at the same time, of course, he's supposedly suggested to European leaders about putting 100% tariff on both India and China over purchases of Russian oil. So, maybe he's trying to play both sides and see where he can get the best leverage from, which is sort of part of Trump's playbook. But, he clearly, if there was ever any doubt, I don't think this US leader is the greatest strategic thinker that we have in the history of US leadership of global issues.
Tongue-in-cheek there, Jim. Let me ask you, what should India expect? Last time we spoke, you said, well, India is in one of those rare positions where, both the global South and, some Western countries court India, want India. There is the China angle. There is a strategic partnership, but it all This
Yeah.
experience over the last 1.5 odd months has left a very bad taste in, I'm assuming, most officials' mouths and leaders, etc., as well, in terms of how to really work through this, because this is the administration you've got to work with for the next 3.5 years at least. What's your sense?
Hmm. Well, at the end of the day, I think the most important thing to not lose sight is that India is, of course, one of, if not the fastest growing large nation in the G20. And the degree of growth that India is enjoying could be, of course, even stronger. And it looks to me as though Modi is trying to pursue some reforms with renewed vigor. And with that, I think many countries around the world, including other members of the G7, certainly speaking as a UK citizen, for the UK included, they want to make sure that they have the right relationship with India so there can be mutual trade and investment benefits from this reasonably unique position of India. And so I think logic would suggest that would condition the way other countries think about how to try and deal with this, but at the same time recognizing that one has to sort of play the Trump game and not deliberately irritate or annoy him. I do quickly add, and it's something of growing intrigue in my mind, if you look at US opinion polls, despite the fact Trump makes so many noises about so many issues and seemingly portrays this idea that he's succeeding, his opinion poll rating in the United States is continuing to weaken. And so, yes, there's another 3.5 years of a Trump-led presidency, but it also is the case that it's now only 18 months to the US primaries, in fact, less, not much more than a year. And some Republican members of Congress are probably getting pretty nervous about that polling. And that will also influence the judgment of other leaders who have to think about their own interests, of course, rather than just being always so focused on appeasing Donald Trump. But at the end of the day, so long as India is continuing to show growth in, let's call it the 6 to 8% range, then I think that will be the core anchoring thing that will make sure that other places still have this sort of pretty unique view of India that we discussed a couple of months ago. And of course now, one would imagine there are going to be more overtures coming from Beijing as well, following what is probably just a nice symbolic diplomatic visit of Modi to Beijing. But I would imagine the Chinese will be wanting to follow up in some ways about trying to do more together as well.
So everyone is hedging their bets, Jim, right? In that sense.
Well, I think with the way Trump's style is, that is certainly an important, let's call it tactical consideration that leaders will probably be thinking about. You know, I don't know whether the UK is benefiting from the fact that Trump's mother was born in Scotland, or that this is one of the very, very few areas where our current Prime Minister seems to have had some vague success. But of course, by being very warm and cuddly to Donald Trump, and he's coming here on an official state visit soon, the UK seems to have got off relatively lightly compared to many other countries that are allies. And so I'm sure here the idea of being nice to Donald Trump as much as you can be is still a big factor in play. But at the same time, I'm pretty sure, I kind of know that the UK is eager to pursue stronger relationships with India as far as it's in the UK's own interests, of course.
Oh, yeah, absolutely right. Just two things I want to ask you one by one, Jim.
Hmm.
You said that China, of course, also perhaps would like to, in that sense, court India. And of course, I mean, India also needs access to lots of stuff, and we've reported this over the last 2 months or so.
Yeah.
Would you imagine, this push, and maybe things get better with the Trump administration, but this push and the experience over the last 1.5 months, in a way, forces India to repair relations with China, which also, by the way, have been pretty poor since 2020. Those Galwan
Yeah.
clashes, direct flights have not been there for the last 5 years. Those are restarting, and many other things seem to be happening. You think those all remain on track, even if this relationship with the US comes back on track?
Well, I'm going to be my most candid answer is I'm going to be watching for the evidence about this development really closely, Prashant, because as you and I have discussed in the past, not only would the whole BRICS political alliance have considerable greater depth and substance if China and India were more constructive allies with each other. But because of each of those two's global importance, it is very relevant for the rest of the world irrelevance of what the BRICS do together. And here's the odd thing. A normal internationally minded US leader would actually probably think that would be pretty good for the United States as well. Quite whether Donald Trump would see it that way, because he often seems to think one country's win is another country's loss. But the reality is, if you have the two fastest emerging nations that are already large starting to do more constructive trade and investment together, without doubt, that is beneficial for the whole of the rest of the world. And if it were really serious, as I've written about many times over the past 20 years, it would be extremely positive for the whole world economy. So in some ways, and it goes back to the sort of tongue-in-cheek piece I wrote about Trump being a secret agent for the BRICS, I kind of hope that inadvertently there is going to be more substance to the China-India relationship than there's been for many years, because it would be very helpful for both and very good for everybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing, of course, you mentioned approval ratings, etc., in the US, right, with regards to President Trump.
Mm-hmm.
The Supreme Court in the US is going to take up the matter of tariffs after the appeals court essentially said they are illegal. I mean, let's just assume for a moment the Supreme Court also finds them illegal. Do you think, as many believe, that the tariffs essentially remain pretty central to the agenda for this administration, and they'll find a way, use other sections, maybe it'll be more cumbersome to implement them, but they'll find a way. And tariffs essentially don't go away, even though even if the top court in America rules them illegal. What's your sense?
Well, I mean, can you imagine if that's what's happened? I have no legal expertise, or really, I should just say on the first part of your question, I don't know. But I personally can't imagine a Supreme Court not backing up Trump, because they've virtually backed him on everything he's wanted so far. And so with that proviso, it would be an enormous blow for Donald Trump's preferred strategy if they stop him from pursuing these country-led tariffs. But I quickly add that, as you imply with your question, he would have to, at least tactically, find some other way. And I suspect the default would be to consider more industry and sector-driven tariffs, which I think wouldn't have the same kind of legal challenges, because otherwise it would leave many aspects of the Trump-led strategy in tatters, and of course, including importantly, this sort of creepingly growing notion that the tariff revenues are actually helping to shrink the otherwise very concerning growth of the US fiscal deficit. So I think for him to just say, okay, I lost, I'm going to abandon all of that, would be very hard. There is one other important caveat to add, though, that in the event that US inflation starts to rise further, and since we've last spoke, there are one or two signs, in my judgment, on the core inflation numbers that things aren't improving in the way that certainly the Fed would want. That is not impossible. But if that were the case, then Trump's got a much bigger that many people and real voters in the United States will be increasingly showing evidence that the tariffs are causing inflationary pressures to grow. And if that started to affect the mood of the financial markets, and this current view that the Fed is now on the verge of cutting substantially would be completely reversed, and then you'd have all sorts of problems in the financial markets. And that would probably force Trump to back off whatever tariff strategy he was using. But, that doesn't look as though it's the path that's going to happen in the near future, but it's something that I'm keeping my eye on as well.
It looks like the Fed will cut, next week, 17th, by a 25 basis point. At least that's the market pricing, and maybe, as we've seen many times, what the market assumes and what the realized, cuts are. It's much usually tends to be larger in cycles. If this is the start of a cycle on the way down. Just a word, Jim, on. Do you think, midterms are that point, as many have pointed out, in the US, where there's a bit of a political reckoning, and before that, all of this kind of sort of stays on track, the way it is. Is that the way to look at it?
I think that is the way to look at it right now. You look at all the ongoing evidence that we have, as per the day we're having this discussion. It's pretty clear that the US economy has lost some momentum. When you look at it from a financial, particularly equity market perspective, you tend to lose sight of that a little because of this never-ending, amazing exuberance for AI and tech stocks. But if you actually look at the growing evidence of the real economy, especially following the latest revisions to the employment data, the US economy has slowed quite a bit. And if you put that together with lingering concerns about prices as well as potential inflation issues still, it's very hard for Trump to keep using this really powerful personal style of creating this impression that everything's going so brilliantly well, because at the end of the day, people will notice that in jobs and their incomes and their spending power. And if it carries on like this as we get closer to the end of this calendar year and we move into the year of the midterms, that is going to start affecting how people in Congress and, more importantly, their voters are going to behave next year. And I've read a couple of interesting things recently pointing out that, even though it's very, very different with Trump's amazing personal style, this is not abnormal for a twice running president of either political colour for them to have real issues when they get towards the midterm of their second period of leadership. In Trump's case, obviously, it's been interrupted by 4 years, but something has to give, and it might well be that you get enormous interest rate cuts from the Fed because the inflation evidence turns out to be better than I've implied, and that causes a significant recovery in the consumer's confidence and so on. But at the moment, it looks like many areas outside of the AI and tech-driven space and the investment that's going from the big tech companies, that the US economy is starting to struggle more and more.
And we'll have to watch those data points closely. Jim, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for coming onto this program once again, and really appreciate your time here. Thank you.
You're welcome. As always, it's my pleasure.
It's a wrap on this edition of the Global Reset. Thank you very much for watching. More comes up on the other side.